Star Trek books. They've been around for decades. Join us, the Trek ladies, Kavura and Jen, as we discuss the novels one at a time. Welcome to the Ladies Trek Library. The first book will be Final Frontier by Diane, Carey. This is the story of a hero and a moment forever lost to history. It is a tale of Starfleet's early days, of a time before the Star Trek we know, the story of a secret mission gone horribly wrong, and an instant in time when the galaxy stood poised on the brink of one final, destructive war. It is the story of a ship since passed on into legend and a man we only know as the father of Starfleet's greatest captain. His name is Kirk, Commander George Samuel Kirk. He is a warrior born and bred to battle. Now destiny has placed the fate of 100 innocent worlds on his shoulders and put the power of the greatest weapon the galaxy has ever seen in his hands. All right, so we know that the book has Kirk's father. Jen, what are your first impressions after reading the book?
I really like this book, and I actually would say this is probably one of my favorite Star Trek books that I've read so far. I've only read about 65 at this point, so not as many as you have, but
only 65, okay.
Yeah, considering some of the people we know have read hundreds, 65 is not that many. But yeah, this is definitely one of my favorite stories. It's a really good book.
Okay, I really enjoyed it too. Yeah, this one, I think it is one of the best Star Trek books, actually. I do like that we learn some of the history of Kirk's father and about Captain Robert April, who we know from the animated series was the first captain of the first Enterprise, or at least at the time before they added the TV show Enterprise.
Yeah, I wasn't really, when I started reading it, I knew George Kirk, James T. Kirk's father was in it. I didn't know Robert April was in it. But I really enjoyed those sections, getting to know who that character Robert April was and learning more about George Kirk. It made it really interesting because, obviously I like reading the books about Captain Kirk, but it's always nice to, when authors take characters that are minor or maybe we've just seen in one episode or two in passing and really develop them. It really gave a lot of history to, the Star Trek universe.
And the history was excellent here. It was very well written. The other thing, and let me say, of course, we are going to have spoilers. We will assume that the people listening have read the book. So this book shows the first encounter with Romulans, which we thought was in the episode Balance of Terror. But this book says, well, there was actually another time that humans met up with Romulans, but that one was kept off the records. Now, the way, like Star Trek books have done that before, like with Strangers from the Sky, where it was the first meeting with Vulcans, which they said, well, this story was kept secret, but this is really the first meeting with Vulcans. It's interesting that the books do that, but it's good that they have, the freedom to write stories like that. Like, well, this is the story that you've never heard. And of course, it's not canon, but we can still enjoy it.
Yeah, that is one thing that's great about the stories is that they do have the freedom to do a lot of things that you can't necessarily do in the movies or on the TV shows.
That is great. That's one of the things we like about the books. And the Romulan commander, the Field Primus in this book, to Sail, I thought he was a great character. One thing was he was interested in plants, right? He had this, like his own arboretum in his quarters. That was just a great, new angle that we haven't seen like just about to any character on Star Trek, just to show something like, well, this guy really likes something that's different, and he's an alien, but he knows something, plants, it's something we can relate to here on Earth. We know about these things, and he likes this other form of life.
Yeah, I thought he was a really fascinating character, and he was one of the, main reasons I enjoyed the book. Of course, the other characters as well, George Kirk and Robert April, but I guess to Kyle or to Sale, I'm not sure how we pronounce his name, but what I really enjoyed about how he was developed is that Diane Carey built on the Romulan world that Diane Duane created in books like My Enemy, My Ally, and The Romulan Way, and she sort of used that as a foundation and introduced this character into that. And, a lot of times when you see a show, or even in some of the novels, you just are Romulan commander and you don't really know too much about them, but I really liked how she got right into it and gave us this really vivid description of him on his ship and the situation that he was in, which I guess I can go ahead and start talking spoilers now, right?
Yeah.
We're assuming, okay. So, this situation that he's in on his ship where, he's a bit older and he's a war hero, but, the current government doesn't like him, and so he's been kind of stuck in this position that's supposed to be given to, when you're just sort of put out to pasture, and they just kind of want to get rid of him. And now they've sent out this young man who's, in with the government to try to sort of undermine his authority on the ship. And so he's sort of in this difficult situation where, members of his crew are torn between loyalty to him and, feeling like they have to do with this guy. And I'm not sure how to pronounce his name either. Ryaik? How do you?
Yeah, I guess the readers can always make up how they want to pronounce it. I called it Ryaik.
Ryaik. Okay.
But however you say it, yeah.
So on the one hand, he has his first in command who, is loyal to him, and probably some of the other people would be too, but they fear that if they, are loyal to him, that they could be in trouble, or their families could be in trouble because they've got this guy on board who's kind of like a spy and, could do some damage. So Takale is sort of in this position where he's, it's a difficult position for him to be in.
Yes, and it was interesting how they put in, the way you said Diane Carey carried out Diane Duane's initial view of the Romulans. It had the like everything you mentioned, the politics or the backstabbing, the treachery, the intrigue of the Romulans. All of that is interesting, and we've seen it on the shows, but it was developed much more on The Next Generation, which this book was released in 1988. The Next Generation started in 87, so we can imagine this book was being written at the time that TNG came on. So I think the writer didn't know how they were going to do the Romulans at the time, but she did it in a way that, in that way, having the Romulans being so plotting and treacherous was, it still stays in character with them, which was great. And carrying on what was in, like you said, My Enemy, My Ally, and The Romulan Way, having, the same structure, the Romulans having the Praetor and having Tassel, as I call him, being sort of put out to pasture, which is the same thing as AAL and My Enemy, My Ally. I mean, she had been doing something similar because they kind of thought that, they were suspicious of her and so wanted to put her on some assignment where she wasn't doing much.
Yeah, very much the same situation as she was in. And getting back to what you were saying before, I also really like how she, the author, describes Tassel's, his passion, which is not being in charge of this fleet. He kind of looks at it as an assignment that's kind of beneath him. And so his, passion is botany, and his quarters are filled with all these exotic plants, and he spends his time, researching all this. And that really was a fascinating side to his character.
And another way that something that Diane Carey added to the Romulan structure was the having a swarm. I mean, that was different, having like a series of ships called a swarm, and Tessale was in charge of it. That was a new twist on the Romulan military that I liked.
Yeah, that was really interesting. The swarm, how there's he's basically in charge of a large group of ships who sort of the mothership takes them a place because that they couldn't go on their own because they don't have the distance capability, and then they all sort of swarm off. That was pretty interesting.
And also, I want to mention Diane Carey. I saw her at a convention once. She was at CreationCon Atlanta back for the 50th anniversary in 2016, and she's a great speaker. She's a really funny lady, and she mentioned that she used to be a deckhand on some ships in the past, so she knows about working on a real ship. I mean, and that's great. That contributed to her writing, and she wrote other Star Trek novels like Dreadnought, which had very long battle scenes. So she's, really into the military and this type of writing.
Yeah, that is really interesting. That makes sense, as to how she got into all the ins and outs of what's happening, not only on the Romulan ship, but on the Federation ships. But getting back to the Tessale, one other thing that I had written down that I thought was interesting. So he has, his second in command who's loyal to him. But just to give you an idea of, how she depicts the Romulans, as you were saying, with all the treachery and backstabbing, she's loyal to him, but she also never really understands him. And there's on page 44 in my book, she says, how long would she have to know him before she actually knew him? And that kind of stood out to me as sort of a defining characteristic of him. He's sort of very mysterious. She sort of she's loyal to him, but she sort of views him and his hobby of botany as, maybe he's a little crazy. But he surprises her because in a scene where Ryak comes to his quarters and she's there and they're discussing things, and Ryak kind of threatens him, she's kind of thinking he's going to be put in his place by this young guy, and he doesn't let that happen. He basically hits him and tells him to get out and tells him off. So on the one hand, you have this guy who's, really into his plants and sort of, kind of introverted and self-examining, but he's not afraid to take charge when he has to.
That was great. It shows that he's the one in command, and he deserves it. He earned it. I mean, he takes command. He is in charge, and he doesn't let anybody get away with threatening him or anything.
Yeah, exactly.
And another thing about Tessale, it was his insight into humans, and he did say that he had been on a covert mission before where he studied humans. Yeah, that part I wasn't sure about in the book because it kind of, how much, this is saying some Romulans already knew a good deal about humans even before they supposedly knew what each other looked like, but I think he must have already known. But something interesting things he found out in his study of humans, because he had been on the covert missions, he learned to speak Federation Standard, and he said that humans trust what they can see face to face. That's one of the things he knew about them, which was, you can kind of see it. Humans like to trust people. It's, the people in the Federation are a little more trusting than Romulans are, who are suspicious of everyone. And another thing that Tessale said was, for humans, the emotion that is fed is the one that grows. I love that too, just the way that was a great insight that he got out of studying a race that was alien to him.
Yeah, and that really just goes to show how, what an intelligent guy he is, that he's here studying the enemy, and he's learned as much as he can about humans, including learning to speak Federation Standard to really get to understand his enemy. Whereas when we, meet Captain April and George Kirk, although April is a pacifist, so he doesn't really view Romulans necessarily as his enemy, but George Kirk, a military guy, really doesn't know anything about them. And there's a scene in the book where George Kirk is with his friend, they're both security officers, and he's kind of joking about it, and his friend says, says, you don't even know what a Romulan looks like, and he basically says he doesn't want to know, and his friend calls him a bigot, and, Kirk has sort of made up his mind that he doesn't like Romulans, even though he really knows nothing about them. So that's what makes it really interesting when he and Sale finally meet, because they're sort of the opposites in that way. Kirk doesn't know anything about Romulans at that point, was pretty prejudiced against them, didn't want to know anything, whereas Sale had really made an effort to learn a lot about humans. A very good contrast between the two characters. And the thing about George, okay, so now that we're getting into like Kirk's father, Jim Kirk's father, George. So George was a security officer, and he was very militaristic, and he was more suspicious of people, and he was a little more gung-ho, like, well, let's shoot them, that kind of thing. I mean, it was, very interesting to see him that way instead of, George, even though Jim Kirk was a man of action, but he was still more, a little more open to meeting people than the way George was. Yeah, and I think the author definitely tried to make a clear point in contrasting George Kirk with Robert April, who was sort of his opposite. George Kirk, being a security officer, he's a man of action. He's, a military guy. He's very suspicious of people. He doesn't trust people. He kind of feels like action is the way to go. Maybe sometimes, doesn't think before he acts. And Robert April, total opposite, a pacifist. He's sort of always in his head, hesitating to take action, like a dreamer. And the author really tries to make a point that really neither one of them makes the ideal captain. And the ideal captain is someone who can have both of those qualities, who ends up, she tries to clearly point that James T. Kirk embodies both of Robert April's and his father's best traits to make an ideal captain.
That's true. And even though we would probably imagine that Jim Kirk might not have, he wouldn't have seen both of them together to see both of how their command styles are, unless he read about it, he wouldn't have really known that. But that is the way he turned out to be. So it's great that he became that type of captain. Robert April, and we didn't really know as much about April before this book, because he was only on one episode of the animated series. But to find out that, the book says he kind of doubts himself as a commander. He thinks that he's not the type of person that should really be in command of a starship, because he's less a man of action.
Yeah, and one thing that was really interesting about getting to know Robert April was also how Diane Carey portrays these early days of the Federation, it's very different from what we know from the original series, even though it takes place maybe only, 25 or so years prior. We see that the Federation is sort of very decentralized. They don't have any large ships like the Enterprise that are on these exploratory missions. They're, smaller ships. So Robert April is not used to being a military type of commander, because he's mostly traveling around inside of Federation space, on, peaceful type missions. So that contrast was really interesting to see that sort of history of the early Federation.
And some interesting things, since this book takes place in the past, before the original series. So the ship they were on was actually the first starship, and it didn't have a name at the time. It wasn't Enterprise. It was just a what they called a starship. And they did mention that the bridge was gray because it hadn't been painted yet. I love that idea too, because when we saw, the cage and, in that episode, the bridge, how it was all gray, and then later when we get to the man trap, it's very colorful. So they explain that in this book by saying, well, it's new, it just hasn't been painted yet.
Yeah.
I love that, yeah.
Yeah, so that unnamed ship, which we, know is going to eventually be named the Enterprise, that's the first ship of its kind. And it's really interesting because they talk about how the Vulcans helped with its design and programming, but they wouldn't give them a specialist to run it. And because apparently the Vulcans didn't want to be a part of a crew with humans. And I thought that was like a little interesting thing for her to slide in. Because supposedly, Spock is the first Vulcan to be a part of a human crew, and this sort of explaining, why that is. The Vulcans just didn't want to mix in with humans.
Another thing that worked out well with canon, with the show Enterprise, where we find out that Vulcans didn't want to work with humans as much in the past, and so this explains it, even though this was written way before Enterprise. Yes. And another thing was this book had, it also mentioned a cloaking device, where they used it as a bluff. They said the Federation has ships that are cloaked, and then, they were using that to scare the Romulans. It was totally fabricated. So now we see why, and Tassel said, well, now that the Romulans think that the Federation has a cloaking device, they're going to try to build one. So that sort of explains why they had the cloaking device.
Yeah, that was funny. The reason the Romulans developed a cloaking device is because they thought the Federation had one, even though they didn't.
Yes, that was a great twist. So, and we'll just talk about the little blurb at the end of the book. So after the story ends, and then they say what happens to the characters. And so they said that George Kirk and Tassel, and of course Tassel he had plastic surgery so that he looked human, so that he could live among the humans. And he became sort of a diplomat and someone who gave advice on diplomacy. And George Kirk was his security officer. They worked together, and they eventually went off on a mission together and disappeared and were never heard from again.
Yeah, there's more I want to talk about earlier, but yeah, that part at the end left me wondering a couple things. One, was Diane Carey leading up to writing some sort of sequel in which we find out what happens to George Kirk, because she sort of leaves it at, and then eventually he goes on a ship and it disappears. But as far as I know, that was never resolved in any of her books. I could be wrong. Maybe I haven't read it. Go ahead.
I haven't heard of any anything explaining that anywhere. It would be interesting to look up something, or maybe in fan fiction, maybe someone wrote something about it.
Yeah. So that was a little interesting little cliffhanger there that made me wonder about what she was thinking. And then, of course, the other part about how Tassel goes on to live the rest of his life as a human and be a civilian consultant for to the Federation as far as diplomacy. And that reminded me of the Romulan Way, when we have the Federation spy living on Romulus who eventually becomes a Romulan senator. I don't know how plausible it is that he could live the rest of his life as a human and no one would notice, especially considering he's, consulting with the Federation. But that was an interesting little ending, and, it'd be great to see if there's any fan fiction out there. I'm sure there probably is about, the rest of his life living as a human.
Or you could write it. But, I think he could live as a human just as far as getting along with people and talking to people. I think I mean, he had enough respect for humans and knew enough that it would work. The problem seems like it would be with, if he had any health problems and someone found out he had green blood, he would have to have a doctor he could trust that knew who he actually was, you know?
Yeah, well, that was my thought, because they at first, when he realized he was never going to be able to go back to Romulus, and that he'd be spending the rest of his life in the Federation, George Kirk is suggesting, well, you could just say you're a Vulcan. But quickly realized that nobody was going to buy that he's a Vulcan, considering he, is not trained to suppress his emotion, and
yeah, he would have to be a radical Vulcan. Yeah,
have plastic surgery and become a human. Which, yeah, I mean, he could probably fit in as a human, but the obvious being, he's going to live a much longer life, and might be difficult to conceal that he's not a human if there are any medical issues, but we can pretend.
Yeah. Okay, so what other thoughts did you have about the book?
Well, one thing that I really enjoyed about the format of the book, which I read a little bit about how Diane Carey had initially wanted to write, this story with George Kirk and the Romulan commander and Robert April, but I think the editors also wanted her to tie it into Captain Kirk. So the way that she does that is there are small scenes with Kirk, with James T. Kirk, Captain Kirk, where the story starts off in the prologue with Kirk reading letters that his father had written him when he was in Starfleet. And he talks about the fact that, although in those times nobody really writes letters through the mail, that his father liked to write letters to his son using a pen and paper, because he says, you'll touch the paper and know that I touched it too. So I really enjoyed that format. It reminded me, I have letters that my grandmother wrote me when I was younger, and, I can, now that she's died, I can look back and see her writing and think of her, and it's sort of the same thing. We don't know we know now, when Kirk is reading these letters that his father wrote him, that his father at that point had been missing for many years, and he didn't know what happened to him, presumed dead. So he's sort of like looking back, through this window into his past. And I really enjoyed how they worked that into the story.
That was a great twist, and it's funny because, and I'm sure Diane Carey wouldn't have known this, but I mean, no one writes letters now, so it's old-fashioned to us now, and so to read it in this book and to think in the 23rd century, well, I mean, it's even more archaic to them, but it was a great twist in the book. Yeah, I love that, the fact that he wrote letters, and Jim Kirk loved reading the letters.
Yeah, that made me think, when I first started reading that, before she goes on to explain George Kirk's reasoning for writing that way, I'm thinking, oh, in the 23rd century, he's really still writing letters by hand and mailing them on paper. But then she explains, oh, well, you know what, nobody does this anymore, but this was a thing that his father liked to do.
And Kirk also used it as a healing process, because for him this took place after City on the Edge of Forever, where he had lost Edith Keeler, so he was depressed, and so reading the letters helped him kind of recover.
Yeah. Other things that I really liked about this book, again, going back to the history of the early Federation, so she intentionally, as you mentioned, the scenes with the Enterprise being gray and unpainted. In this one, the unnamed ship is not even finished, and there's still open circuitry, and they have the skeleton crew, and they have this new thing called the library computer, which George Kirk is not really certain about using this library computer. So that made me laugh.
Yeah. Another thing, something that we kind of take for granted now, and they put it in can you imagine what people thought of it back then? Right.
And, another thing that she threw in, so this was the reason that this ship is called out on this mission, which we didn't even get into, is that a passenger ship has been stranded in an ion storm, and they can't get out, and no other ship at the time is, fast enough to be able to get there in time before these people die. So this is the first ship that really can go to warp, and they call it a warp hop, and it's like a brand new thing to them. So that was interesting to see, first warp is a warp hop, and they're all like amazed that, the ship can go this fast.
That was an interesting idea. So the reason they actually used this ship was because it was a rescue mission. That's the reason they took the ship out before it was actually completed. One thing it does seem like they took, so we find out that there's a saboteur aboard the ship, and he caused what appeared to be an accident that put the ship right in the middle of Romulan space. That part didn't seem exactly like it would have worked, because how can the ship just be instantly in Romulan space? We don't have ships that fast now,
Yeah, I agree. That was the one little nitpicky thing that I felt like, okay, so it turns out that the ship has some saboteurs aboard who are posing as scientists, but they're actually humans who have been raised in the Romulan Empire. And, Tsail goes on to explain that, I guess before the Earth Federation War, there were human colonies that settled in what is now Romulan space, and they stayed there, and now these are humans who, live as Romulans. And I was like, I don't know if I can buy that, but...
Yeah, knowing that Balance of Terror was supposed to be the first time that the two races knew what each other looked like, that part didn't really seem to jive.
Yeah. But I guess that was the only way to get the ship stranded in Romulan space and have the whole rest of the story take place.
Yeah, that's true. And another thing to me, it just seemed like they spent so long in Romulan space, it doesn't really seem like they would have been able to rescue the other ship. They did. They went back and rescued the ship that was stuck in the ion storm. But it almost seemed, because they kept saying time was of essence, and it seemed like they spent too much time in Romulan space for them to have actually rescued the other ship in time.
Yeah, they did seem like they spent a lot of time in Romulan space, and a lot of time before they even got attacked. They did try to explain that, most of the Romulan fleet was off on another border, fighting there, and they ended up very close to the Romulan homeworld, which was not very heavily defended. And that part to me also was a bit, I don't know if I can necessarily buy that, but, it made the story work, so.
Okay, any other thoughts then?
Yeah, well, I'm getting back to Tsail. Another thing that I really wanted to talk about with him is that, I think she used him as to sort of also show, so, she uses April and George Kirk as a way to show if these people came together, look what they can do together. And I think she also uses Tsail as a way to show someone who's a great diplomat. And there's one thing there are several great things that he says that really stood out to me. And at one time he's having a conversation with George Kirk, who's still very prejudiced against Romulans, and there's actually this great scene where George Kirk is supposed to meet Tsail on the planet, on this planetoid, so that they can sort of have like a, peace conference, I guess, to try to talk about the situation.
Yes.
Each ship agrees to send someone down. And the first time George Kirk sees Tsail, he thinks, and he's there with his two bodyguards, he thinks, and the bodyguards have their helmets on, so you can't really see what they look like, and he assumes that Tsail is a Vulcan, and that these two Romulans have taken him prisoner, and he's trying to rescue him. And it's really funny because Tsail sort of goes along with it and, tries to pretend like he needs to be rescued. And then eventually, based on the fact that he's sort of laughing, George Kirk realizes that Tsail can't be a Vulcan.
Oh, I love that scene too. Yes, that was funny, and that was a brilliant piece of writing there. I thought, yeah, I love that scene.
Yeah, that was really good. But once he starts getting to know him, George Kirk starts expressing his prejudices about Romulans, and Tassail says this. It's just a great. I'm just going to read it. He says, "You assume a bad system is made up of bad people. You forget that greed and power abuse the closest people first, one's own people. My people are the first victims, those who have paid the longest for our ways. We no longer have a mechanism for change. Your own history of war should prove that to you. A few leaders using drum beating and patriotic rhetoric to continue the masses of things no sensible person would otherwise approve of. Such powers can make naked evils seem like duty, and people will do that duty unconditionally. My culture or yours, it makes no difference, Kirk." And I think, that's the first time that George Kirk really starts to understand that the Romulans aren't just a bunch of bad guys, that a lot of them are good people trapped in a bad system. But I also love that quote because I think, like a lot of Star Trek, it's really relevant to what's happening in our world. And that stood out to me because that was, this book was written over 30 years ago. But even then, reading that quote, it's just something that's very relevant even to this day.
It shows the great insight that Tassail had. And so he had all these great ideas. And I think he was probably more suited to live among the humans because the humans were more open to listening to that kind of talk. I mean, he tried to, if he tried to tell that to the Romulans, and they're more interested in power and authority. And so, yeah, he had all these wonderful ideas that were just, almost too good for his own people at the time.
Yeah, and I really felt like the author did a really great job of getting insight into the pain that he must have experienced, being someone who loves his own people and seeing what's happening to them and really feeling powerless to do anything to stop what's happening. And then when he has to witness, when Riak takes over his ship, he realizes that the only way that could have happened is that his first officer had been killed, and that's very painful for him because she was loyal to him. And then, of course, he has to see the destruction of the entire swarm, his own crew, plus, some of the crew from these other ships on the swarm, including a friend of his. And you really get a sense of how that must feel like for him. And he even, at that point, tells George Kirk just to leave him on the planet to die because, he can't go back to Romulus. And
he didn't see any other alternative, right?
Right, yeah.
So living among the humans probably did turn out the best thing for him. Yeah, that would be great to read a story about what happened to him afterwards. I mean, to actually see how well he adapted.
Yeah. And then another great, and this book, what I love about this book besides the great characters are the themes. There's just so many great Star Trek themes in this book. It's another one is this theme that Robert April sort of has to deal with about whether or not his philosophy of pacifism, whether he can uphold that at all costs, because he comes to realize that, if he wants to preserve the ideals that he believes in, sometimes force is necessary, and he really doesn't want to use force, but when the alternative is his crew dying, the Romulans dying, he sort of is forced to make that compromise.
And it's sort of why he chose George Kirk to be on the ship. He had George and George's best friend Drake kidnapped and brought to the ship to help him. But he knew that George was the type of contrast to his personality that he needed.
Yeah. So they both represent the contrast, and it's interesting how he's finally able to sort of realize that he's going to have to compromise, even though he really held out into the end and to try to not use any kind of force. And then other great themes that I thought in this book were, when George Kirk and Tikale are on the planet together, and, Kirk has to sort of overcome his prejudices. That's one thing. Some insight that we get from Tikale is that he understood right away when he's still on his ship and they get the communication from the ship that will be known as the Enterprise. And his crew hear this communication from them, and they're immediately ready to, we want to, attack the ship. And he sort of understands that, hey, when people are using this is coming across through a universal translator, that translators don't necessarily capture the true meaning of things, and that intentions, just because you hear something one way does not mean that's really what the intention is, with differences in language and culture. And really we should try to communicate with these people one-on-one so that there are no misunderstandings, because just because we hear something one way does not mean that's what the intention was. So that was a really interesting, insight to understand that differences in language and culture can cause misunderstandings even when there's no ill intent.
Yes, and he's the one who knew that. I mean, he understood things so well, and the relationships between the races. I mean, as a military commander, he was just so much more. Yeah.
So those are some great, and of course then, we have him and George Kirk being forced to put aside their differences to work together, as well as George Kirk and Robert April having to put aside their differences to work together. So that was another great Star Trek theme. And then, of course, the theme of, when should we use force to protect the values that are important to us? So those were all themes throughout the book that I thought were great, and really made this like a very Star Trek book, if that makes sense.
Oh yes, it's great. Yeah, there were so many different angles to the book. There's so much depth to it, so many levels, so much to talk about. Those are all excellent points, Jen. Thank you.
Yeah, and then I would like to say about the one thing that I loved about the ending. So, of course, going back to the letters, we have Captain Kirk reading his father's letters, and one of them ends with, initially we should say when he's reading these letters, his father's kind of telling him, you don't want to come out here, and, you wouldn't like it here, there's not much for kids to do, and that kind of thing. But after he has this experience, and he writes this other letter, and in the last letter that he reads says, come out to space, I'll be waiting for you. And so then it just really makes you, I can just imagine Captain Kirk sitting he's reading this in the barn at his farm in Iowa, and I could just imagine him, reading that letter as a boy and dreaming of space, going out to space where his father's waiting for him.
Yes, that letter, the one that said, come out here, I'm waiting for you, that's the one that changed Jim's mind. That's the one that made him think, I do still want to be a captain, of course.
Yeah, that, and then the other great thing at the end was that we find out the little blurb that we hear at the beginning of Star Trek. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise, her 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life, new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before. Those are actually the words of Captain Robert April addressing the United Federation of Planets at a time when the Enterprise is being commissioned. Or actually not when it's being commissioned, when it's being transferred from Robert April to Captain Pike. So I thought that was really cool that she made those words be the words of Robert April.
Yes, that was great too. A good way to fit it in, the segue of transition there. Okay, that was all great. So we both agreed that we both loved the book. We both enjoyed it.
Yeah, definitely I highly recommend this book. One of my favorites, as I said, and just, so many great Star Trek themes, great characters, great writing, a great history of both the Federation and Romulus.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the force be with you. Nanu Nanu.